Elijah sat in the back of the classroom, his eyes glued to the desk in front of him. He could feel the eyes of his classmates boring into him, and as usual, they were filled with judgment. The whispers, the looks of disbelief, the way they all seemed to think that someone like him, someone with his background, would never amount to anything. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to find out, was that he wasn't like everyone else. And today, it was time to prove it. The bell rang, signaling the start of Ms. Parker's history class, and Elijah reluctantly raised his head. He could already feel the tension in the room. Ms. Parker, the one teacher who never seemed to have a kind word for him, walked briskly to the front of the class, her heels clicking sharply against the tiles. She glanced at the class roster, scanning it as if she were hunting for names that stood out, names that mattered. Elijah's name, of course, was one that never stood out. At least not in her eyes. "All right, everyone, settle down," she said, her voice commanding attention. Ms. Parker was a strict, no-nonsense teacher who never hesitated to make her opinions known. And today, her opinion was about to sting. "Elijah," Ms. Parker said, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the class. "I expect you to try your best on this exam. But, let's be honest here, history isn't exactly your strong suit." Elijah felt his heart drop. Her words weren't new, he had heard this type of thing before. But the sting of it never seemed to fade. It was always the same. She saw him as nothing more than a statistic, a kid from a poor neighborhood who wasn't likely to succeed. She didn't see the hours Elijah spent studying, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices he made. She didn't see the fire burning inside him, the desire to prove everyone wrong. The rest of the class fell silent, their eyes flickering between Elijah and Ms. Parker, waiting for his reaction. Elijah's grip tightened on his pencil, his knuckles white. He could feel his face burning with a mixture of anger and humiliation. But he didn't say a word. He knew better than to respond to her public condemnation. Words were cheap. Actions, however, spoke louder than anything he could say. "Ms. Parker," a voice interrupted, and Elijah's head snapped up. It was Tasha, his best friend, sitting just 2 seats away. Tasha was the one person in the room who never doubted him. The one person who saw more in him than just the label society put on him. But even Tasha knew that speaking up to Ms. Parker was dangerous territory. "She's just stating the truth, Tasha," Elijah said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's fine. I don't need her to believe in me." Tasha shot him a sympathetic look. "You know you're smarter than she gives you credit for, right?" Elijah didn't respond. Instead, he just stared at the desk in front of him, his mind racing. What if she was right? What if I don't belong here? But deep down, Elijah knew that wasn't true. He did belong here. He wasn't going to let one person's ignorance define him. He wasn't going to let her narrow view of the world hold him back. He had more to offer than anyone could imagine. As the class dragged on, Elijah's mind wandered. He thought about the countless nights he had spent in the library, poring over textbooks and notes, trying to catch up, trying to stay ahead. He thought about his mom, working double shifts just to keep a roof over their heads, the sacrifices she made to give him the chance at a better life. He thought about the dreams he had, the future he was determined to build for himself, away from the chains of poverty and prejudice. "No one gets to decide my future but me." The class finally ended, and as Elijah gathered his things, Ms. Parker gave him one last look. "I expect you to do well, Elijah. But I won't be holding my breath." With those words hanging in the air, Elijah walked out of the classroom, the weight of her words still heavy on his shoulders. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, and it wasn't going to be easy. But he wasn't afraid of a challenge. In fact, he thrived on it. And if Ms. Parker thought he was going to fail, well, she was about to be proven very wrong. Elijah's mind began to race with possibilities. He had always been told he wouldn't make it. He had always been told he was destined for failure. But what if he could do the impossible? What if he could show everyone, including Miss Parker, that they were wrong? This is my chance, he thought. It's time to prove them wrong. Time to show them just how wrong they are about me. As Elijah left the school that afternoon, his resolve hardened. He was going to do whatever it took to change their perception of him. He didn't need their approval, but he sure as hell was going to earn their respect. And it was going to start with something that none of them expected. But what was that something? It would take more than just trying harder in class. It would take something bigger, something that would make them all stop and take notice. And Elijah knew exactly where to start. What if everything you thought you knew about someone was wrong? Elijah repeated to himself as he walked home, his pace quickening. I'm about to show them. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the horizon, Elijah's mind was no longer clouded with doubt. Instead, he felt a spark, a glimmer of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. He was going to take on the challenge, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated. And he wasn't going to stop until they all knew just how wrong they were. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Elijah sat at his desk in the small, dimly lit room that he called his bedroom. The only light came from a flickering desk lamp and the faint glow of his laptop screen. A pile of textbooks sat beside him, stacked high in an attempt to create the illusion of order. But in truth, the mess was a reflection of the chaos that filled his mind. Elijah wasn't a kid who had time to let his room get clean or his thoughts settle. There was always something more important, like surviving. He clicked through the pages of his history book, trying to focus on the chapter on ancient civilizations, but his mind kept drifting. It wasn't that he didn't care about the material, it was just that his life was full of distractions. His mom, working late into the night at the diner, always tried to make sure there was food on the table, but most days, that felt like the only thing keeping them afloat. Elijah had to help out as best he could, which meant juggling schoolwork with part-time jobs, running errands, and doing what he could to keep things going at home. His mom was everything to him. She was the rock in his life, the person who always pushed him to do better, to aim higher. She'd raised him on her own after Elijah's father had walked out when he was just a baby. Elijah had never met his father, and for most of his life, he had never really cared to. His mom was the only parent he needed. She worked double shifts every day, waking up at 5 a.m. to prepare breakfast for Elijah before heading out the door, then coming back late at night to repeat the cycle. She never complained. She couldn't afford to. There was always something that needed to be done, something that required sacrifice. Her strength was something Elijah admired more than anything. But sometimes, he couldn't help but wonder if she saw him as her own personal project. She was always pushing him, telling him he could do more, be more. She had big dreams for him, dreams that involved college, a bright future, a life beyond the confines of their small, run-down apartment. And he wanted to make those dreams come true, for both of them. But he was beginning to question whether he was even capable of living up to them. Elijah could feel the pressure building, a weight he carried every day. His classmates never seemed to understand what he was going through. They had no idea how hard it was to be a teenager, struggling with school, trying to fit in, and also dealing with the invisible weight of expectation that his mother placed on him. It wasn't that she was wrong to want more for him. But the expectations felt like another mountain he had to climb, another burden that no one else seemed to have to carry. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he glanced down at the screen. It was a message from Tasha. Tasha, hey, you coming to the study group later? I know it's a lot, but we're all in this together. Don't let Ms. Parker's crap get to you. You're smarter than anyone gives you credit for. Elijah smiled slightly, a warmth spreading through him. Tasha was always the one to pick him up when he felt like giving up. She had been his best friend since middle school, and unlike the others, she never saw him as just another kid from the wrong side of town. Tasha saw something more. But even her encouragement didn't change the fact that Ms. Parker had already written him off. Elijah's mind drifted back to that moment in class earlier, when Ms. Parker had casually dismissed him in front of everyone. It stung, sure. But Elijah wasn't the type to let insults stick. The truth was, he'd been underestimated his whole life. People had assumed that because of where he came from, he wouldn't amount to much. His teachers, his classmates, the world, they all thought they knew what his future would be. But they didn't. Elijah knew that the story of his life wasn't written yet. And no matter how many people tried to hold him down, he would keep pushing forward. He remembered a time, back when he was younger, when his mom had given him a worn-out book on Einstein. She had said, "The world doesn't know you yet, Elijah. But you've got something inside of you. You have to find it, hold on to it, and let it take you places." At the time, Elijah didn't know what she meant. He was just a kid, trying to understand the world. But as he grew older, the words started to make sense. His mother had always believed in him, even when the world didn't. And now, more than ever, he needed to believe in himself. Elijah had never been one to fit in. He didn't come from money, he didn't have the latest clothes or gadgets, and he certainly didn't have the right connections. But he had his mind. And his drive. And that was enough. It had to be. His thoughts were interrupted by another buzz from his phone. This time, it was a notification from a news app, alerting him to a local IQ test that was being held in a few weeks. It was a competition open to high school students across the city, and the winner would earn a full scholarship to a prestigious college. A full scholarship. Elijah's heart raced as he read the details again. This was it. The opportunity he had been waiting for. The chance to prove everyone wrong, to show them that there was more to him than they could ever imagine. He quickly texted Tasha. "Elijah, you're not gonna believe this, but I'm entering the IQ competition. I'm gonna show them all that I'm more than just a stereotype." Tasha, what? Elijah, you're serious? This is huge. But hey, I'm with you every step of the way. Let's do this. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of excitement, of purpose. This wasn't just about proving Ms. Parker wrong. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever been allowed to believe. He closed his laptop and stared at the clock on his wall. His mom would be home soon, exhausted from another long shift. But Elijah had something important to tell her, something that would show her that he wasn't giving up on the dream she had for him. He was going to take control of his future, no matter how hard it seemed. And this time, he wasn't just going to survive. He was going to thrive. The next few days felt like a blur of preparation and determination. Elijah spent every free moment studying, preparing for the IQ competition. He wasn't just doing it for a scholarship, he was doing it to prove that he could rise above the expectations that had been set for him. The constant whispers, the side glances, the way people expected him to fail, he was done with it. He was going to show them all what he was capable of. But even as he dived into the books, even as he pushed himself harder than ever before, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Ms. Parker's words still echoed in his mind. "I expect you to try your best. But let's be honest here, history isn't exactly your strong suit." Elijah gritted his teeth, remembering her dismissive tone. It wasn't just that she doubted him, it was the way she did it, in front of everyone, like it was a foregone conclusion that he wouldn't make it. As he sat at his desk, papers and textbooks scattered around him, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tasha. "Tasha, Elijah, you're really going through with this, huh? I'm excited for you, but I know it's not gonna be easy. You've got a lot of people who are gonna be watching, waiting for you to fail." Elijah took a deep breath, staring at the screen for a moment. Tasha was right. There was so much riding on this. He had never been the kind of person who enjoyed attention, but suddenly, everything felt like it was under a microscope. Every decision, every move, every mistake, it would all be scrutinized. Still, there was something in him that couldn't back down now. He quickly typed a response. Elijah, I've always had people watching, waiting for me to fail. But this time, I'm not failing. Not this time. He hit send, but before he could put his phone down, a knock came at the door. It was his mom, standing in the doorway, her tired eyes soft but proud. Hey, Elijah, she said, her voice gentle. You've been at that desk for hours. Don't forget to take a break, okay? Elijah looked up at her and smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. She had no idea just how much pressure he was under. How the weight of her dreams for him felt like it was slowly crushing him, every day. I'm fine, Mom. Just a little more studying, he said, his voice sounding more confident than he felt. His mom gave him a knowing look. Elijah, I know you're trying hard, but you need to take care of yourself too. You've been through a lot already. I just want you to be happy. Whatever happens with this competition, just remember that I'm proud of you. Her words were like a balm on a wound, and for a moment, Elijah almost believed her. But he couldn't let go of the fear that he was disappointing her, that his best might never be enough. He needed to prove to her that all the sacrifices she'd made, all the late nights, the exhaustion, had been worth it. I'm not giving up, Mom. You'll see, he said, the words more for himself than for her. His mom's expression softened. She walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. I know, Elijah. I know. Just don't forget to be kind to yourself along the way. Elijah nodded, but deep down, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. The days leading up to the IQ competition were filled with a growing tension that hung in the air. Elijah spent hours practicing, memorizing formulas, solving puzzles, reading through logic problems, and doing everything he could to prepare. But the more he worked, the more doubts began to creep in. What if it wasn't enough? What if he failed, just like everyone said he would? What if he wasn't smart enough? The night before the competition, Elijah found himself sitting in front of his desk, staring at the test papers spread out before him. He had memorized every detail, every trick and pattern, but there was still that voice in the back of his mind, nagging him, telling him that it wasn't going to be enough. Maybe they're right, he muttered to himself. Maybe I don't belong here. The thought felt like a heavy stone in his chest, and he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to shake it off. But when he opened them, the image of Miss Parker's disappointed face popped into his mind. She had already written him off, already assumed he wouldn't make it. And that was the problem, wasn't it? Elijah had spent his whole life trying to prove everyone wrong. He was constantly fighting against their assumptions, their biases, their low expectations. And maybe that was the problem. He had spent so much time trying to prove other people wrong that he had lost sight of why he was doing this in the first place. It wasn't about Ms. Parker. It wasn't about his classmates or anyone else who doubted him. It was about him. He was doing this for himself. He was proving to himself that he could overcome the obstacles life had thrown at him. That no matter what anyone thought of him, he could be more than just the kid from the wrong side of town. And if he could do that, maybe, just maybe, he could help his mom live the life she deserved. Maybe he could change their lives forever. Suddenly, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Elijah stood up, took a deep breath, and closed his textbooks. Tomorrow, he was going to walk into that competition with everything he had. He wasn't doing it for the approval of anyone else. This was his moment, and he was going to seize it. He wasn't just going to try his best. He was going to prove that his best was more than enough. The day of the IQ competition arrived, and with it came an unshakable wave of nerves. Elijah had barely slept the night before, his thoughts swirling with anxiety and self-doubt. He had spent hours studying, but no matter how much he prepared, he couldn't help but feel like he wasn't ready for what was about to happen. When he entered the competition hall that morning, his heart pounded in his chest. The room was filled with other students from all over the city, all sitting in rows of tables, focused and ready. Some of them were already talking in hushed tones, whispering to each other like they had it all figured out. Elijah felt out of place, a fish in a tank full of sharks. He walked to his assigned seat, trying to keep his head down and not make eye contact with anyone. He knew he didn't belong here, not in the way they did. They all seemed like they had been groomed for this, like they had the kind of life that made competitions like this feel like a natural next step. Elijah, on the other hand, had spent most of his life just trying to survive. It had never been about trophies or recognition. It had been about getting through the day, making sure his mom had food on the table, and keeping his head above water. As he sat down and adjusted his pencil, a quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey, you here for the competition too?" a boy next to him asked, his voice friendly, but with an edge of curiosity. Elijah glanced at him, surprised. The boy was wearing a crisp, well-ironed shirt, his glasses perched neatly on his nose, giving him the look of someone who had probably been in 100 of these kinds of events. Elijah nodded, his nerves still causing his fingers to twitch. "Yeah," Elijah replied, forcing a small smile. "Just trying to figure it out." The boy nodded understandingly. "I get it. Nerves hit everyone. But hey, if you need any help with the puzzles, let me know. You seem like the type who can work through them." Elijah blinked, taken aback. It wasn't the typical vibe he got from the other kids here. Most of them looked at him like he didn't belong. But this kid was different. And for a split second, Elijah felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't so alone after all. Before he could respond, the loudspeaker crackled, signaling the start of the competition. "Attention, everyone," the voice said. "Please take your seats. The IQ test will begin in 5 minutes. Remember, you'll have 3 hours to complete the entire exam. No talking. No distractions. Good luck." Elijah's stomach did a flip as the reality of the situation sank in. This was it. This was his chance. He couldn't back out now. He had to give it everything he had. The clock above the door began to tick down. 5 minutes. 4. 3. 2. 1. And then, with a sharp beep, the test began. The first hour passed in a blur. Elijah focused as hard as he could, trying to work through the problems one by one. Some of the questions were simple logic puzzles, others were complex patterns that tested reasoning and analytical skills. But despite the pressure mounting with every passing second, Elijah found himself slipping into a rhythm. He could do this. It wasn't just the answers that mattered, but the way he approached the problems. He had been practicing for months, his mind was sharp, honed by the quiet hours spent in his room, reading and solving puzzles. The more Elijah worked through the problems, the more confident he felt. He glanced around the room. Some of the other students seemed tense, their pencils scratching furiously on their papers. Others were hunched over their desks, their faces twisted in frustration. Elijah didn't feel that way. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was in control. The boy beside him, whose name Elijah still didn't know, caught his eye and offered a quick thumbs up. Elijah returned the gesture, a flicker of pride flashing in his chest. This was it. This was where he could prove not just to Ms. Parker, but to himself, that he was capable of greatness. Then, as the final hour of the test approached, something unexpected happened. Elijah reached the last section of the exam, a series of logic problems that stretched on for several pages. He had breezed through everything else, but this was different. The puzzles were more complicated than anything he had ever encountered, the kind that tested spatial reasoning, memory, and intricate problem solving. For the first time that day, his confidence wavered. The walls in his mind seemed to close in, and the room suddenly felt much smaller. What if I can't solve these? What if I don't have the answer? His mind raced as he stared at the first puzzle. A complex web of shapes and patterns, each one connected by lines that seemed to swirl and twist in an endless loop. He felt the weight of the clock ticking, each second moving faster than the last. He bit his lip, trying to steady his breathing. His pencil hovered over the paper, unsure where to start. The room seemed to blur around him, the soft hum of the air conditioning mixing with the frantic scribbles of his classmates. He glanced at the clock, 45 minutes left. Come on, Elijah. Focus. Elijah closed his eyes for a brief moment, calming himself, then reopened them with renewed determination. He began to break down the puzzle, looking for patterns, searching for clues in the seemingly random shapes. Slowly, almost methodically, he started to work his way through it, one small step at a time. The minutes ticked by, but Elijah didn't notice. His mind was in full gear now, his focus narrowing to just the task at hand. As he filled in the final answers, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. I did it. The bell rang. It was over. Elijah set down his pencil, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The room fell silent as the proctors moved through the aisles, collecting test papers. But Elijah sat back in his chair, feeling like something had changed inside him. He had done it. He had faced the challenge, the pressure, and the self-doubt, and he had come out on top. As the proctors called for everyone to leave, Elijah gathered his things slowly, his mind buzzing with the realization that he had just done something he once thought impossible. He glanced over at the boy sitting beside him, who gave him another thumbs up, a grin stretching across his face. Elijah smiled back, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. He didn't need anyone's approval. He had done it for himself. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what the outcome was, nothing could ever take that away from him. The results came in 2 days later, but it felt like a lifetime. Elijah hadn't realized just how much he had been dreading this moment until he found himself pacing back and forth in the living room. His mom was at work, so it was just him, waiting, silently battling his own anxieties. The envelope with the results sat on the table in front of him, a silent reminder of everything that was at stake. It had been a roller coaster of emotions since he left the competition hall. In the hours after the test, Elijah felt like he had done everything he could. He had pushed past his fears, solved puzzles he'd thought were beyond his reach, and most importantly, he had proven to himself that he was capable. But even with that accomplishment, the doubt still lingered. The doubt that maybe it wasn't enough. That despite all his hard work, there would be someone who was better, someone who deserved the scholarship more than he did. Someone who could validate all his efforts. He picked up the envelope and held it in his hands, feeling the weight of his future resting in its contents. His heart raced as he tore it open, the paper inside crinkling with anticipation. He pulled out the letter, his eyes scanning the first few lines. Dear Elijah Williams. We are pleased to inform you that your performance on the recent IQ competition has exceeded expectations. Based on your score, you have been selected as one of the finalists for the scholarship opportunity. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He read it again, then again, as if trying to make sure it was real. He hadn't just exceeded expectations, he had surpassed them. He was a finalist. The overwhelming wave of emotion hit him like a tidal wave. It was relief. It was pride. But most of all, it was disbelief. He had done it. He had really done it. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, and he felt a lump form in his throat. It was too much. Too much for him to process all at once. All those long nights, the studying, the sacrifices, the loneliness, all of it had led to this moment. This moment where he stood on the verge of changing his life forever. He set the letter down on the table and slumped into the chair, his hands trembling. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe. Like the weight on his shoulders had finally lifted. Just then, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Tasha. Tasha, I saw the results. I knew you could do it, Elijah. This is just the beginning. Get ready for the next step. Elijah smiled through his tears. He quickly typed a reply. Elijah, I can't believe it. I actually did it. The message sent, but Elijah was too overwhelmed to feel much relief yet. He had been working for this moment for so long, and now that it had arrived, he couldn't quite wrap his mind around it. He was a finalist. He was one step closer to a scholarship that could change everything. The door opened just then, and Elijah's mom walked in, looking tired from a long day at work. She froze when she saw the expression on his face. Elijah, she asked, her voice cautious, sensing that something had happened. What's wrong? Why do you look like that? Elijah stood up, the letter still in his hand. He didn't need to say anything. He simply handed it to her, and she read the words slowly, her face a mixture of disbelief and joy. Her eyes darted up to his, and without a word, she enveloped him in a tight hug. Elijah could feel her warmth, the strength that had carried them both through the hardest times. I knew you could do it, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I've always known you were special, Elijah. He squeezed his mom tighter, the tears falling freely now. It wasn't just the letter. It wasn't just the recognition. It was everything, the years of struggle, the nights of doubt, the moments when he felt like giving up, it was all worth it. For this. For this moment with his mom. The two of them stood there, holding on to each other for what felt like an eternity, until Elijah pulled back, wiping his face with the back of his hand. Mom, I did it. I made it to the next round. She smiled, her eyes filled with pride. You did more than that, Elijah. You showed everyone just what you're capable of. But even as his mom celebrated, Elijah couldn't shake the shadow that still loomed over him. The competition wasn't over yet. There was still the final round to face, and a part of him feared that it would all come crashing down. What if he couldn't make it through the next part? What if he wasn't good enough? As if reading his mind, his mom placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. I know you're scared, Elijah. I know this feels like it's just the beginning of another fight. But you've already proven more than anyone ever expected of you. You've already done something incredible. Elijah nodded, trying to absorb her words. He wanted to believe them. He needed to believe them. Thanks, Mom, he said quietly. She kissed him on the forehead. No matter what happens from here, Elijah, I'm proud of you. You've already won. The next day, Ms. Parker called him into her office, her expression unreadable. Elijah's heart skipped a beat, wondering if she had heard the news yet. Elijah, she said, without preamble. I've seen the results of the competition, and I must admit, I was surprised. Elijah held his breath. He couldn't tell whether she was disappointed or impressed. I want you to know, she continued, that I was wrong about you. I underestimated you. I thought you were just another kid who would fall through the cracks. But you've proven me wrong. And I respect that. Elijah's heart pounded. He had expected a speech about how she had always believed in him or some backhanded compliment, but this was different. This was honest. For the first time, Ms. Parker wasn't looking down on him. She was acknowledging his hard work. Thank you, Elijah said, his voice steady. That means a lot. She gave him a small nod. You've earned it, Elijah. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As he walked out of the office, Elijah felt something shift inside him. He had fought so long to prove himself, to push past every assumption and doubt. And now, for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything to anyone. He had already won. And the best part? The journey was just beginning. The days following the announcement were a blur of emotions. Elijah had barely been able to focus on anything outside of the scholarship competition. But now, reality was setting in. This was it. The final round. The ultimate test that would determine everything. He was no longer just a participant in a competition, he was a contender, a young man with the potential to change his entire future. As the day of the final test approached, the weight of it all became heavier. Elijah tried to stay calm, tried to keep his mind focused, but the doubts that had plagued him before resurfaced. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he couldn't perform under pressure? What if the whole thing was just a fluke? It didn't help that he was still surrounded by students who seemed to have everything figured out. The pressure of competing against them, the ones who had been bred for this kind of academic excellence, was suffocating. They were polished, confident, poised, everything he wasn't. But as he stared at the envelope that would soon carry him to the final round, he thought about his mom. He thought about Tasha, who had never wavered in her belief that he was capable of more than the world expected. He thought about the moments in the competition hall, when he felt the surge of confidence that came from pushing through his own self-doubt. He was more than his circumstances. More than the assumptions people made about him. He could do this. He would do this. The night before the final round, Elijah sat at his desk, papers and notes scattered around him, trying to memorize as many formulas and strategies as he could. His mind, however, was racing in a million directions. Every time he tried to focus, he found himself lost in his thoughts, imagining what would happen if he failed. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his spiral. It was a message from Tasha. Tasha, you've got this. No one knows you like I do. All that matters is that you're ready to give it everything you have. Elijah stared at the message for a moment, the words sinking in. She was right. All that mattered was that he gave his best. Whether he won or not, the effort was what would define him. He wasn't here to prove anyone wrong, he was here to prove to himself that he could be more than the world expected. A knock at the door broke his train of thought. Elijah? It was his mom. Are you okay? He turned to her and forced a smile. Yeah, just nervous. You know, the usual. She stepped into the room, sitting down next to him. I know you're nervous. You're scared. And that's okay. But remember, this isn't about the competition. It's about you proving to yourself what you're capable of. Elijah nodded, his throat tight. He wasn't sure he could put his thoughts into words, but his mom always seemed to know exactly what he needed to hear. You've worked so hard for this, Elijah, she continued, her voice soft but firm. Don't let fear control you. Tomorrow, when you walk into that room, know that you've already won. You've already given it everything you have. And that's enough. Her words settled in his heart like a balm, soothing his nerves, if only for a moment. He looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something close to peace. He wasn't in this alone. His mom had been by his side through every hardship, every obstacle. And that same love and support would carry him through whatever came next. The morning of the final round, Elijah felt like he was stepping into a new world. The weight of the competition, the expectations, the hopes, all of it was now a part of him. But he carried it differently. Instead of feeling crushed by the pressure, he stood a little taller, walked a little more confidently. When he arrived at the venue, he was met by the same sea of polished faces, students who were perfectly prepared, dressed to impress, exuding an aura of success. But Elijah didn't feel small anymore. He was one of them. He belonged here. And for the first time, he realized that he wasn't competing against them, he was competing against his own fears, his own insecurities. As he entered the large auditorium, he was handed a packet with the final exam instructions. His heart skipped a beat. The room was quiet except for the faint rustling of paper. The proctors stood at the front, their faces unreadable. The competitors were silent, their expressions a mix of focus and anxiety. Elijah took a deep breath and walked to his seat, the quiet hum of the room almost deafening. This was it. No turning back now. He opened the packet, scanning the instructions. The questions were unlike anything he had faced before, complex, multifaceted problems that required deep understanding, precision, and ingenuity. They weren't just logic puzzles, they were real-world applications, designed to test not just raw intelligence but creativity, adaptability, and problem-solving skills under pressure. As the clock began ticking, Elijah felt his heartbeat steady. He had prepared for this moment, even if he hadn't fully understood what he was preparing for. The hours of practice, the late nights, the quiet self-doubt, all of it had led him here. He dove into the first problem, methodically breaking it down, looking for patterns, clues, connections. With each answer he wrote down, he felt the pressure easing, the doubts receding. He was in his element now. But just as he was beginning to gain momentum, the questions grew even more complex. He could feel the tension in the room rise as the other students worked through the problems at lightning speed. Some seemed to be breezing through them, while others were struggling, their brows furrowed in concentration. Elijah's mind, however, remained focused. The questions were tough, but he didn't back down. Each one was a challenge he had the tools to solve. With every passing minute, his confidence grew. Then, near the final stretch of the test, a problem appeared that made Elijah pause. It was unlike anything he had seen before, a riddle that required both logic and creativity in equal measure. The kind of problem that could stump even the brightest minds. Elijah's first instinct was to panic. But then he remembered what his mom had said. "You've already done your best." And in that moment, he realized she was right. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about the process. It was about approaching each challenge with everything he had, trusting that, no matter the outcome, he had given it his all. He took a deep breath and began working through the riddle, thinking about the problem in ways he hadn't considered before. Slowly but surely, the answer began to form, piece by piece. And when the bell rang, signaling the end of the test, Elijah sat back in his chair, feeling an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. He didn't know if he'd won or lost. He didn't even care. He had given it everything he had, and that was enough. As the proctors collected the test papers, Elijah stood up, feeling a deep sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything to anyone. He had already proven everything he needed to prove to himself. And as he walked out of the room, he knew that no matter what happened next, his life had already changed. The days following the final test passed in a blur, a whirlwind of waiting, doubt, and anticipation. Elijah couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the results were just around the corner, but not quite close enough to reach. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat, only to be disappointed when it was a message from someone else, a classmate, his mom, or sometimes even Tasha, reminding him to hang in there. But no one truly understood the weight of the waiting. To everyone else, it was just another competition. To Elijah, it was a life-altering moment. His future was hanging in the balance, and it felt like the world was holding its breath, just as he was. It was a Thursday morning when the email arrived. Elijah was sitting at the kitchen table, the sound of his mom moving around in the other room, preparing for work. He had already finished his breakfast and was scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly, trying not to obsess over the upcoming results. And then it came, an email from the scholarship committee. His breath caught in his throat as he hesitated for a moment, staring at the subject line. Final results, scholarship decision. Elijah stood up slowly, walking toward the window as his heart raced. He needed a moment to steady himself before he clicked open the email. He could feel his hands trembling, but there was no turning back now. He opened the email, scanning the lines quickly. Dear Elijah Williams, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as the recipient of the Scholarship for Exceptional Students. Your performance in the final round of the competition exceeded expectations, and we are thrilled to offer you the full scholarship to the university of your choice. Elijah's world slowed down as the words settled into his mind. He read them over and over again, not quite understanding at first what they meant. You have been selected as the recipient. The weight of the words hit him all at once, like a wave crashing over him. The scholarship. The one thing he had worked so hard for, the opportunity that could change everything. It was his. He closed his eyes, a wave of emotion flooding over him. The room around him seemed to disappear, and in that moment, it was just him, alone, in a moment of quiet triumph. Everything he had fought for, everything he had endured, had led him here. When he opened his eyes, he saw his mom standing in the doorway, her face full of concern. "Elijah? What's wrong? What happened?" He turned to her, his voice barely a whisper. "I got it, Mom. I got the scholarship." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You're kidding." "No," Elijah said, shaking his head as the tears started to well up in his eyes. "I really got it." His mom let out a loud laugh of pure joy, her hands flying to her face as she took in the news. Without another word, she ran to him and wrapped him in the tightest hug. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The magnitude of what had just happened was understood in the embrace, the shared understanding of the struggle and the triumph. "I knew you could do it," she whispered into his ear. "I always knew you could do it." Elijah hugged her back, unable to find the words to express what he was feeling. He didn't need to. He just held her tightly, letting the moment wash over him. His dreams were becoming a reality, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. Later that afternoon, Elijah made his way to Tasha's house. He couldn't wait to tell her. He had promised her that he'd make it, and now, he could finally keep that promise. When Tasha opened the door, she immediately saw the look on his face. She knew. "You got it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. Elijah just nodded, his face breaking into a wide grin. "I told you," she said with a laugh. "I knew you could do it." He stepped inside, and the two of them sat down, talking about everything that had happened since the test. Elijah told her about his nerves, his doubts, and his ultimate realization that the true victory wasn't in winning the scholarship, it was in the journey he had taken to get there. "This feels like more than just a scholarship, Tasha," he said, his voice full of conviction. "It's like I'm finally seeing who I really am. Not just who everyone else thinks I am." Tasha smiled at him. "Exactly. You've always been capable of this, Elijah. It was just a matter of showing the world what you can do." Elijah sat back, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. It was true. It wasn't just the scholarship. It was everything he had learned about himself. The way he had grown, the way he had fought against the odds, against his own self-doubt and the expectations placed on him. He hadn't just proven himself to others. He had proven it to himself. Over the next few weeks, the excitement of winning the scholarship began to settle into something more like acceptance. Elijah still couldn't quite believe it. He had gone from being the overlooked, underestimated kid to someone who was on the verge of achieving his dreams. And he wasn't done yet. The transition into college life would be challenging, no doubt. The scholarship would cover tuition, books, and even some living expenses, but the real challenge would be in continuing to prove that he belonged. He wasn't naive enough to believe that things would be easy now. He knew the world would still expect less of him, still look at him and see the stereotypes. But Elijah was no longer the person who had to prove himself to others. He had already done that. Now, he was doing it for himself. And when he stepped onto that college campus for the first time, it wasn't with the fear that had once ruled him. It was with the knowledge that he had already beaten the odds. That whatever came next, he would face it with the same strength and determination that had carried him this far. The first day at college felt like stepping into an entirely new world. Elijah had been anticipating this moment for months, but now that it was finally here, he was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of everything. The campus sprawled across hundreds of acres, with towering buildings, sprawling lawns, and endless paths that led to places he had only ever seen on a map. He stood for a moment at the entrance to the main quad, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. This was it, the place that could make or break his future. The university where he would have to prove, once again, that he belonged. And this time, the stakes were higher. The expectations weren't just from the outside world, they were from him, too. He wasn't just Elijah Williams, the kid from the underfunded high school. He was now a scholarship student, a kid who had shown the world he had the potential to excel. But that didn't mean the doubts were gone. In fact, the pressure felt even heavier now that he was here, surrounded by students who seemed so comfortable in their environment. They moved confidently between classes, chatting with professors like old friends, wearing their privilege like a second skin. Elijah glanced around, trying not to let the anxiety get the best of him. He had made it this far. He had beaten the odds before. He could do it again. But this time, it wasn't just about being smart or getting the right answers. It was about fitting in, finding his place in a world that had never truly accepted him. As the days passed, Elijah quickly realized that fitting in would be a challenge. The classes were intense, the professors demanding. And while his peers seemed to breeze through their assignments, he often found himself struggling to keep up. There were moments where he felt like an outsider, like he was watching from the sidelines as everyone else excelled effortlessly. But there were also moments when he remembered why he was here. Why he had fought so hard to be in this position. The late nights, the hours of studying, the moments of self-doubt, they had all led to this. One afternoon, as Elijah sat in the library, surrounded by stacks of textbooks and notes, a familiar face appeared in front of him. Tasha. Elijah exclaimed, standing up quickly. What are you doing here? Tasha grinned, holding up a stack of books. Same as you, I imagine. Trying to survive freshman year. Elijah laughed, relieved to see a friendly face. Yeah, that's about right. Tasha dropped her books onto the table and took a seat next to him. How's it going so far? I know the first few weeks can be rough. Elijah hesitated, looking down at his notes. It's been tough. I'm struggling to keep up. Everyone else seems like they've got it all together. Tasha raised an eyebrow. Everyone, huh? You sure about that? Elijah shrugged, unsure of what to say. I don't know. It just feels like I'm always behind. Like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough. Tasha reached over and patted him on the back. Listen, I know you're used to being the underdog, but this is a different game now. You've earned your place here, Elijah. You're not some charity case. You're here because you deserve to be. Elijah looked at her, feeling a wave of emotion. I don't feel like I belong here. Tasha smiled softly. I get it. But you do belong here. You've got something those other people don't. They might have money, connections, whatever, but you have heart. You've been through things that have made you stronger than most of them will ever know. Elijah thought about her words for a moment, then nodded slowly. Thanks, Tasha. I needed to hear that. Anytime, she replied. Now, let's get back to trying to survive this semester. Over the next few weeks, Elijah began to adjust to the pace of college life. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of moments when he wanted to give up. But he kept going. He kept pushing through, determined not to let self-doubt hold him back. Every time he felt himself slipping, he thought of his mom, Tasha, and all the people who had supported him. One evening, after a particularly grueling week of exams, Elijah was sitting in his dorm room, staring at his textbook. The stress of trying to stay ahead, of keeping up with the workload, was starting to take its toll. His brain felt like it was fried, and his body was exhausted. Just as he was about to close his book and call it a night, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tasha. Tasha, hey, you still alive? Wanna take a break? I know a good place for coffee. Elijah smiled and quickly typed back. Elijah, I think I need to take a break before my brain melts. Where are you? The response came instantly. Tasha, meet me at the cafe in 20. You can't study forever, Elijah. He tossed his books aside and grabbed his jacket. The weight of his worries seemed to lighten just a little as he walked out of the dorm, eager to see Tasha and take a break from the stress of it all. The cafe was small and cozy, with warm light spilling from the windows and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Tasha was sitting by the window, already sipping on a cup of coffee. She waved as Elijah walked in. Hey, long day? She asked, setting her cup down. You have no idea, Elijah said, sitting across from her. I feel like I'm drowning in assignments. Tasha grinned. Yeah, that's college for you. But you're handling it better than you think. I don't feel like I am, Elijah admitted, rubbing his eyes. Some days, it feels like I'm the only one struggling. Everyone else is so ahead, so sure of themselves. Tasha raised an eyebrow. Really? I've been here a month, and I still don't know anyone who has it all figured out. Believe me, you're not the only one who feels lost. Elijah let out a long sigh. It just feels like I'm not keeping up. Like I'm always 2 steps behind. You're not behind, Elijah, Tasha said firmly. You're just on your own path. Everyone here has their own journey. Yours is just different. You'll get there. Elijah leaned back in his chair, looking out the window for a moment. I'm trying. I really am. But some days, it feels like I'm not enough. Tasha smiled softly. You're more than enough. You've been proving that since day one. As the weeks turned into months, Elijah began to find his rhythm. He wasn't perfect. He still had moments where he doubted himself, where he felt like giving up. But with every passing day, he grew more confident. He was no longer just the kid from a small town who had earned a scholarship. He was a student at one of the top universities, working his way toward a future that was entirely his own. And through it all, Tasha remained by his side, reminding him that no matter what, he wasn't alone. He had come so far already, and the best part was that this was just the beginning. Elijah had been in college for over 2 months now, and while he was beginning to adjust, he still felt like he was walking on a tightrope. Each day brought new challenges, more tests, more assignments, and the constant pressure to perform at the highest level. Despite his earlier resolve to push through, there were moments when he questioned if he truly belonged here. But then, something happened. It was late one Friday afternoon, and Elijah was in the library, as usual, surrounded by textbooks and notes. His head was spinning from all the material he had to cover for the upcoming exams. As he scanned the pages of his history textbook, his mind began to wander, and for the first time in a long while, he realized something. He had been so focused on trying to keep up with everyone else, trying to prove that he belonged, that he hadn't been allowing himself to enjoy the process of learning. He had always been the kind of student who did well when he truly engaged with the material, when he allowed himself to get curious. Yet, here he was, burnt out and exhausted, simply going through the motions. The competitive pressure, the constant self-doubt, had clouded his ability to embrace the very thing that had gotten him this far, his love for learning. He let out a sigh, closing the book and running a hand through his hair. He needed a break. A couple of hours later, Elijah found himself walking through the campus park, the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grass. He breathed in deeply, feeling the cool air against his skin. The quiet was a welcome reprieve from the chaos of his mind. He wasn't sure where he was headed, but he wasn't in a hurry. His thoughts were still racing, but this time, he didn't mind. The pressure that had been hanging over him for the past few weeks felt just a little less suffocating. Maybe it was the fresh air, maybe it was the realization that he didn't have to constantly prove himself. Either way, something had shifted. He sat on a bench near the fountain, watching as students milled about, heading to their next classes or hanging out with friends. It was a normal college scene, the kind of thing Elijah used to think he would never be a part of. And yet, here he was. As he sat there, a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey, stranger." Elijah turned and saw Tasha approaching, her trademark grin spreading across her face. She sat down next to him, not waiting for him to say anything before launching into her usual chatter. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" Elijah smiled but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gazed out at the students passing by, deep in thought. "Talk to me, Elijah," Tasha said, nudging his shoulder. "You've been a little distant lately. What's up?" Elijah let out a long breath. "I'm just tired. Tired of feeling like I have to prove myself all the time." Tasha tilted her head in confusion. "You've always been the guy who thrives under pressure. What's different now?" "I don't know," Elijah replied, feeling a weight in his chest. "It's like, the more I try to prove I belong here, the less I feel like I do. Everyone around me just gets it, you know. They fit in so easily. I can't shake the feeling that I'm just pretending." Tasha was quiet for a moment, processing his words. Then, she spoke slowly, her voice gentle but firm. "Elijah, you're not pretending. You're here because you earned your place. Every single person who's made it this far has struggled with the same things. They've all felt like they didn't belong at some point. Hell, I still feel like that sometimes." Elijah turned to look at her, surprised. "Really? Really," she confirmed. "College is this huge, intimidating place. But the thing is, no one has it all together. Some people hide it better than others, but trust me, no one has it figured out. It's just about taking it one day at a time." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, letting her words sink in. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been so focused on everyone else's success that he forgot about his own journey. The truth was, he wasn't pretending. He had earned his place here, his grades, his scholarship, everything. It didn't matter that the path had been harder for him. It was still his. "I guess I just need to stop comparing myself to everyone else," Elijah said quietly. "That's the spirit," Tasha said with a smile. "You've got this. Just remember, it's okay to struggle. It's okay to not have all the answers. What matters is that you keep going." Elijah felt a sense of relief wash over him, as if the weight he had been carrying for weeks was suddenly a little lighter. It wasn't a solution, but it was a shift in perspective. Maybe he didn't have to have everything figured out right now. Maybe the most important thing was just to keep going, keep learning, and trust that he would find his way. The next few weeks were still tough. The exams came and went, and there were moments when Elijah still felt overwhelmed by the pressure. But something had changed. He wasn't looking at his classmates anymore with envy or fear. Instead, he focused on his own progress, on the small victories that were often hidden behind the weight of his expectations. He was doing well in his classes, despite the struggles. His professors had started to take notice, and his peers, while still impressive, no longer intimidated him as much. He knew what he was capable of, and that was all that mattered. And then, a few weeks later, an opportunity came that he never expected. It was a Monday afternoon, and Elijah had just finished a particularly grueling calculus lecture. As he was packing up his bag, his professor, Dr. Matthews, called out to him. "Mr. Williams, could I have a word?" Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if this was a good thing or a bad thing, but he nodded and walked over to the professor's desk. "Yes, Dr. Matthews?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dr. Matthews smiled warmly. "I've been reviewing your work, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You've been excelling in this class, despite some of the challenges you've faced. I think you have real potential, Elijah." Elijah blinked, surprised. "Thank you," but I'm just trying to keep up with the workload. You're doing more than keeping up, Dr. Matthews said, his tone serious now. In fact, I'd like to offer you a research assistant position in my department. I think you have the skills and the drive to contribute to some of the projects we're working on. Elijah's mouth went dry. A research assistant position? Are you serious? Dr. Matthews nodded. I wouldn't offer it to you if I didn't think you were ready. You've got a sharp mind, Elijah. I'd like to see you push yourself further. Elijah couldn't believe it. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to prove himself in a way that was beyond the classroom. It wasn't just about grades anymore. It was about contributing, making a real impact. I don't know what to say, Elijah stammered. You don't have to say anything right now, Dr. Matthews said with a smile. Just think it over. We'd love to have you on board. As Elijah left the classroom, his mind raced. This was it. This was the break he had been waiting for. The chance to do something that mattered, to show everyone, including himself, that he wasn't just some kid who didn't belong here. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Elijah couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Matthews' offer. A research assistant position. He hadn't expected this. The whole idea seemed so surreal. He'd worked so hard just to get to college, to prove that he belonged. But now, this was something entirely different. This wasn't just about surviving the academic pressure, this was about taking the next step, about stepping into the future he had always dreamed of but never really allowed himself to fully imagine. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, moving through his classes on autopilot. His mind kept going back to the research opportunity. What if he failed? What if he wasn't as good as Dr. Matthews thought he was? But then, another part of him pushed those thoughts away. What if you succeed? He asked himself. What if this is exactly what you've been working for? That night, after his last class, Elijah found himself sitting in the campus cafe, waiting for Tasha. It had become their routine to meet up here after a long day of classes, talk about their struggles, and share whatever small victories had made the day bearable. He was eager to tell her about the research assistant offer, but at the same time, he wasn't sure what to expect from her reaction. When Tasha finally arrived, her eyes lit up the moment she saw him. Elijah. You look like you've got something on your mind, she said, dropping into the seat across from him. He grinned, his heart still pounding in his chest. I do, actually. Dr. Matthews offered me a research assistant position today. Tasha's eyebrows shot up. Wait, what? Seriously? Yeah, Elijah said, still trying to process it. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I mean, I'm me, you know. Tasha smiled, her eyes full of pride. And you're more than enough. Elijah, this is huge. This is exactly what you've been working for. Don't overthink it. Just say yes. He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. But what if I'm not ready? What if I can't keep up? I mean, this is big. It's a real step towards something serious. Tasha shrugged. That's the thing about opportunities. They don't come with a perfect moment or a guarantee that you'll be ready. But you are ready. If Dr. Matthews thinks you have the potential, that's all you need. I mean, you've been proving it to yourself every day, right? Her words hit him harder than he expected. Of course she was right. He had been proving it to himself, hadn't he? Every single day since he'd arrived at college, he had pushed himself past his comfort zone. The doubts, the struggles, they hadn't stopped him. He had kept moving forward, despite everything. And now, here was an opportunity to prove that he was capable of more than just surviving. He could thrive. He had to trust himself. He smiled, a little less uncertain than before. You're right. I'm going to take the offer. I'm going to do this. The next morning, Elijah walked into Dr. Matthews' office with a newfound sense of purpose. His heart was still racing as he shook the professor's hand, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself. This was it. This was his chance to prove that he was more than just the scholarship kid, more than just the underdog. This was his moment to shine. "I've thought it over, and I'm ready to take the position," Elijah said, his voice steady, even though his palms were sweating. Dr. Matthews looked pleased. "I'm glad to hear that. I think you'll do great. We'll be working on some exciting projects in the coming months, and I think you'll really enjoy the experience." Elijah nodded, excitement bubbling up inside him. This was the kind of opportunity he had dreamed of back when he was still sitting in his high school library, working late into the night to finish assignments that barely mattered to anyone else. Now, he was on the verge of something real, something that could shape his future in ways he never imagined. "I'll do my best," Elijah said, feeling a sense of pride in his words. He wasn't just saying them out of habit, he truly believed it. In the days that followed, Elijah dove headfirst into his new role. The research projects were challenging but fascinating. He was working closely with Dr. Matthews and a team of graduate students, analyzing data, drafting reports, and contributing ideas. It was like stepping into a new world, one where his intellect was finally being challenged in ways he hadn't experienced before. There were moments when he felt out of his depth, but he reminded himself constantly that he had earned his place. He was here because he deserved to be. The work wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. Slowly, Elijah began to feel like he was truly part of something larger than himself, something that mattered. He was no longer just trying to survive, he was thriving, contributing to something bigger. And with every passing day, the doubts that had once plagued him began to fade. He wasn't some outsider anymore, he was a member of the team. It wasn't long before the fruits of Elijah's labor started to show. A few weeks into the research, Dr. Matthews invited him to present their findings at an academic conference. Elijah's heart skipped a beat at the thought of speaking in front of scholars, professors, and students from across the country. It was a huge opportunity, but also incredibly daunting. Would he be able to handle the pressure? He spent the next few days rehearsing his presentation, refining his research, and rehearsing in front of a mirror. With Tasha's encouragement, he found the strength to push past his nerves. When the day of the conference arrived, Elijah felt both nervous and excited, a powerful combination that made him feel more alive than ever. Standing before the audience, Elijah took a deep breath and began his presentation. His voice was calm, but his heart raced with each word he spoke. It wasn't perfect, but it was authentic. He talked about the research they had done, the data they had gathered, and the conclusions they had drawn. It was hard to tell if he was making an impact, but when the presentation was over, the room erupted in applause. Elijah couldn't believe it. He had done it. He had presented his research to a room full of strangers, and they had responded positively. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly in control of his destiny. As he walked off the stage, Dr. Matthews came up to him with a proud smile. "You did great, Elijah," he said. "You're a natural." Elijah felt a surge of pride, a feeling that had become all too rare for him in the past. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally where he was meant to be. As he walked back to his dorm later that night, Elijah couldn't help but think about how far he had come. Just a few months ago, he had felt like an outsider, overwhelmed and uncertain. Now, he had proven himself in ways he never thought possible. He had earned his place, not just at the university, but in this world. He had shown himself and everyone else, that he wasn't just capable, he was exceptional. And as he thought about all the challenges ahead, he realized something important: he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one moment in your life where you surprised yourself by going further than you ever thought possible? The days following Elijah's breakthrough at the conference were filled with a strange mixture of triumph and uncertainty. The applause, the praise, it had all been intoxicating. But there were moments when the success felt almost too good to be true. It wasn't that Elijah didn't believe in his abilities, it was more that the weight of his success started to feel like an enormous expectation. He was doing well in his research assistant role, his grades were solid, and for the first time, he felt like he was actually making progress. But even with all of that, there were moments when doubt crept in. Am I really good enough for all of this? He'd come so far, but what if it all came crashing down? What if he failed? What if he wasn't cut out for this after all? The pressure was mounting, and he wasn't sure how to deal with it. He hadn't had to face the weight of expectation until now. Before, it had just been about surviving. But now, Elijah was expected to perform, to succeed, to live up to the promise everyone saw in him, including himself. One Friday afternoon, he found himself sitting on the steps outside his dorm, staring at the sprawling campus. It was a beautiful day, with a crisp breeze and clear skies. He should have been enjoying it, but instead, he felt trapped in his own mind. He had just received an email from Dr. Matthews, asking him to help with a major presentation that would be showcased at a prestigious academic symposium. Elijah knew this was a huge opportunity. It was the kind of thing that could propel his career forward, especially if the project was well received. But the closer he got to it, the more he felt the weight of it all. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, Tasha's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. He looked up to find her standing there, looking at him with concern. She was holding a coffee in one hand, offering him the other. I'm just thinking, Elijah said with a sigh, accepting the coffee and taking a small sip. Dr. Matthews just asked me to help with this big presentation at the symposium. It's huge, but I feel like I'm not ready for it. What if I mess it up? Tasha sat down beside him, her eyes full of empathy. Elijah, you are ready. You've been preparing for this your entire life. You've got the skills. And you know that the fear you're feeling? That's a sign you're on the verge of something amazing. Elijah wasn't sure he believed her. What if I fail? What if all this success is just a fluke? But Tasha didn't seem to notice the doubt in his eyes. She continued, the fear is normal. It's the fear that drives you to do better, to be better. But you can't let it control you. You've earned this. You belong in that symposium, just like you belong at this university. Elijah stared at the ground, his mind still spinning. It's just, so much pressure. What if I let everyone down? Don't think of it as letting anyone down. Think of it as showing the world what you've got. You've already proved that you can do it. Don't let fear hold you back from going even further. This isn't just about the opportunity, it's about what you can learn and how far you can push yourself. Her words resonated with him, though the doubt still gnawed at his insides. He wasn't sure how to stop it, how to silence the little voice in his head telling him he wasn't enough. But one thing was clear, he couldn't back down now. He took another sip of his coffee, the warmth filling him as he made a decision. All right. I'm going to do it. I'll take the challenge. Tasha grinned. That's the Elijah I know. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Elijah threw himself into the project with a new sense of determination. He worked tirelessly with Dr. Matthews and the team, gathering data, refining theories, and preparing the presentation. Every day felt like a new obstacle, a new challenge to overcome. And while Elijah felt more and more like he was in control, the doubt still lingered. The closer the symposium got, the more the pressure built. Elijah found himself staying up late, often feeling exhausted, but unable to stop. He was obsessed with getting every detail right. Every data point had to be perfect. Every argument had to be ironclad. He knew the stakes were high. This could be the moment that launched his academic career. But with every passing day, the pressure grew. There were moments when Elijah found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, unable to silence the voice inside his head. What if I fail? What if I freeze in front of everyone? What if they laugh at me? It wasn't until the night before the symposium that Elijah hit his breaking point. After a full day of rehearsing and reviewing his notes, he stood in front of his mirror, staring at his reflection. His hands were shaking, his stomach twisted in knots. What if I'm not good enough? He whispered to his reflection. There was a knock at the door. Elijah turned quickly, startled. When he opened it, Tasha was standing there, her face full of concern. You okay? She asked softly. Elijah shook his head, letting out a shaky breath. I don't know. I feel like I'm going to mess it all up. Like I'm not ready for this. Maybe I'm not cut out for this after all. Tasha stepped inside, sitting beside him on his bed. Listen to me, Elijah, she said firmly. You've been doubting yourself since day one, and every time, you've come through. You've got everything it takes. You've been working for this moment. And you know what? It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be nervous. But that doesn't mean you're not ready. Her words struck him deeply. He wanted to believe her, but the fear was overwhelming. It felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the unknown. Tasha placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do this alone. You've got me, you've got Dr. Matthews, and you've got yourself. And I believe in you. Elijah closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. It wasn't easy, but Tasha was right. He wasn't alone. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let his fears hold him back now. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with determination. You're right. I'm going to do this. I'm not going to let fear stop me. Tasha smiled. That's the Elijah I know. The next day, Elijah stood backstage at the symposium, his heart pounding in his chest. It was his turn. As he walked onto the stage, the lights seemed brighter, the room quieter, and the pressure heavier than ever before. But then he remembered something. He had worked for this moment. He had earned his place here. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone else, it was about showing up for himself. With a deep breath, Elijah began his presentation. The spotlight was blinding. Elijah's hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone, his heartbeat thudding in his chest like a drum. He stood in front of an auditorium filled with some of the most brilliant minds in academia, and despite the butterflies swirling in his stomach, he stood tall. This was his moment, the moment he had worked for. He glanced at the slides on the screen behind him, then at the sea of faces staring back at him. For a split second, doubt threatened to creep in, but he forced it down. I belong here. I've earned this, he reminded himself. He began his presentation with a steady voice. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elijah Mitchell, and today I'm going to talk to you about our research into the impact of cognitive biases in decision-making. The words came out smoother than he expected. He hadn't anticipated that being prepared would feel like such a relief. The research was his. The ideas were his. He knew the data, the conclusions, and the arguments. This wasn't just something he was reading from a script, it was his hard work, his passion. As he delved deeper into the material, explaining the theories and presenting the results of their research, Elijah noticed that the room, which had initially seemed intimidating, began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a community of peers. The subtle nods of approval from some of the audience members, the questions from others, it all helped him realize something important. I wasn't here to impress anyone. I was here to share something that mattered. When he reached the end of his presentation, Elijah took a breath and paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before he spoke again. This research is just the beginning, he said, his voice more confident now. The implications of our findings could help us understand the way people make choices, choices that affect everything from business to personal relationships to public policy. I hope you'll all continue to explore these concepts with us as we move forward. The room erupted in applause. Elijah felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. He had done it. He had faced his fear and delivered a presentation that not only felt right, but also felt meaningful. The standing ovation was more than just a recognition of his academic work, it was a moment of self-affirmation. He was no longer just a student trying to prove his worth. He was a contributor to something larger, something that could change the way people thought about their decisions. Later that evening, after the symposium had ended, Elijah found himself back in his dorm room, still riding the high of the presentation. His phone buzzed with messages. He smiled as he saw a message from Tasha, "You did it. I'm so proud of you." His heart swelled with gratitude. Tasha had been there for him every step of the way, through the moments of doubt and fear. She had reminded him that he was capable, that he didn't have to be perfect, he just had to show up and give his best. But as the excitement slowly wore off, Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping in. The applause had been wonderful, but now what? Was this the peak of his journey, or was there more to come? What's next? He thought, staring at his phone screen, the words from Tasha still glowing in his notifications. The following weeks felt like a whirlwind. Elijah's academic career was gaining momentum faster than he had ever imagined. Dr. Matthews had been impressed with his performance at the symposium, and word was spreading about the promising young researcher. More opportunities began to present themselves. Elijah was asked to collaborate on additional projects, and some of the top graduate programs were taking notice of his work. But with the new recognition came new pressure. There were more deadlines, more expectations. His research assistant position was demanding, and now, Elijah found himself struggling to balance his academic workload with the increasing responsibilities that came with his newfound success. He was constantly running between meetings, research sessions, and presentations. It was exhausting. The demands were more than he had ever anticipated. There were moments when he felt like he was drowning in the weight of it all. But he wasn't ready to admit it to anyone, least of all himself. One particularly difficult afternoon, Elijah sat in his usual spot in the campus library, staring at a stack of books and papers in front of him. His mind felt foggy. The words on the page seemed to blur together, and he couldn't concentrate. He rubbed his eyes, frustrated with himself. He had been pushing himself harder than ever, and it was starting to take its toll. He hadn't had a proper break in weeks. He barely remembered the last time he'd had a full night's sleep. And it was only getting harder to keep up. The door to the library opened, and Tasha walked in, looking around until her eyes landed on him. She made her way toward him, her expression immediately softening when she saw the exhaustion on his face. "Hey, Elijah," she said gently, sitting down across from him. "You all right?" Elijah forced a smile. "Yeah, just, a lot on my plate. You know, the usual." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "I'm not buying that. You've been working non-stop. You're barely sleeping, and every time I see you, you look like you're about to crash. You can't keep doing this." Elijah let out a deep sigh, the weight of the situation finally hitting him. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, Tasha. There's so much pressure, so many expectations. I feel like I'm constantly on the edge, like I'm about to slip and fall." Tasha's face softened with concern. "You don't have to do it all by yourself, Elijah. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to take a step back and breathe. No one expects you to be perfect all the time." "I don't know how to stop, though," Elijah admitted. "I'm scared of falling behind. I'm scared of failing." Tasha reached out, placing her hand on his. "You're not alone in this, Elijah. You've got people who believe in you, people who are here to support you. Don't let the pressure get to you. It's okay to take a break. You don't have to prove anything to anyone except yourself." Elijah looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. It wasn't often that he let himself be vulnerable, but something about Tasha's presence made it easier to open up. He had been carrying the weight of his success, but maybe it was time to share the burden. Maybe it was time to admit that he couldn't do it all alone. "You're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I do need to slow down. Just, take a breath." Tasha smiled warmly, her hand still resting on his. "And when you do, I'll be right here. You've got this, Elijah. But you don't have to carry everything by yourself." That night, Elijah made a promise to himself. He would continue pushing forward, but he would also allow himself moments of rest. He didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to do it all. And maybe, just maybe, it was okay to ask for help. He wasn't alone in this journey, and that made all the difference. The weeks following his conversation with Tasha were a mix of deep reflection and renewed energy. Elijah had learned an invaluable lesson: it was okay to take a break. It was okay to lean on others, especially when the weight of everything became too much to carry alone. The truth was, he had been so focused on achieving greatness that he had neglected to acknowledge his own limitations. But now, he had a healthier perspective. He would still push forward, but he would also allow himself to slow down when necessary. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the pressure threatened to swallow him whole. There were still nights when his mind raced with thoughts of deadlines, responsibilities, and expectations. But there was also something else now, a small, yet powerful sense of inner peace that came from knowing he didn't have to shoulder it all by himself. One afternoon, Elijah found himself back in the same spot in the campus library, a place that had become both his sanctuary and his battleground. He was working on a research paper that was due in 2 days, but unlike the past few weeks, there was no frantic energy coursing through his veins. Instead, he found himself focused, calm, taking breaks when needed, and most importantly, trusting that things would fall into place. As he clicked through a few pages on his laptop, a notification popped up on his screen. It was an email from Dr. Matthews. Subject: Invitation for Advanced Research Program. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the email. The message was short and to the point. Dear Elijah, I hope this message finds you well. I would like to formally invite you to join an advanced research program we are launching in collaboration with a few of the top universities in the country. Your work on cognitive biases and decision-making has impressed several of our colleagues, and we believe you would be an excellent addition to this program. Please let me know if you're interested in learning more about this opportunity. I look forward to your response. Best regards. Dr. Matthews. For a moment, Elijah just stared at the screen. His hands hovered above the keyboard as the weight of the invitation sank in. This was it, the kind of opportunity that could change everything. This wasn't just another project. This was a chance to be part of something much larger, a network of scholars and researchers who were shaping the future of their field. But despite the excitement, a familiar voice of doubt whispered in the back of his mind. Am I really ready for this? The truth was, the advanced research program was for the brightest minds, and Elijah hadn't been in the academic game for long. What if he didn't measure up? What if they realized he wasn't as capable as they thought? Shaking his head, Elijah quickly typed a response to Dr. Matthews. Subject: Invitation for Advanced Research Program. Dear Dr. Matthews. Thank you so much for the invitation. I am truly honored by the opportunity and would love to learn more about the program. Please let me know the next steps. Best regards. Elijah Mitchell. He hit send, but as the email was sent, a new wave of doubt washed over him. What if they're making a mistake? What if they're overestimating my abilities? The thought lingered for a while, but this time, Elijah pushed it aside. He had come too far to let fear dictate his actions. This was an opportunity he couldn't afford to ignore, and even if he wasn't entirely certain of himself, he knew one thing: he wouldn't let it slip through his fingers. A few days later, Dr. Matthews scheduled a meeting with Elijah to discuss the details of the research program. When Elijah walked into the office, Dr. Matthews greeted him with a warm smile, and Elijah could tell right away that the atmosphere was different, more serious, but also more welcoming than he had expected. "Good to see you, Elijah," Dr. Matthews said, motioning for him to take a seat. "I'm glad you responded to the invitation. We've been very impressed with your work so far." Elijah sat down, his nerves prickling slightly. "Thank you, Dr. Matthews. I'm really excited about this opportunity." "Good. Now, let me give you a bit more detail about what this program entails," Dr. Matthews began. "This is an intensive, year-long research initiative where we'll be working on cutting-edge projects related to cognitive science. The program is highly competitive, but we've selected only a handful of students who we think are ready to take on the challenge. Your ability to synthesize complex data and think critically has impressed me, and I believe you'll be an asset to this team." Elijah felt a sense of pride swelling in his chest. The compliments were nice, but it wasn't just about the praise. It was about the recognition of his potential, the belief that he could do something truly important. "But there's more," Dr. Matthews continued, leaning forward slightly. "This program comes with a significant commitment. You'll be expected to work closely with experts in the field, collaborate with other students, and contribute to groundbreaking research. It will be demanding, Elijah. But I believe you have what it takes." The weight of Dr. Matthews' words sunk in, and for a moment, Elijah felt the full scope of what he was about to sign up for. This was no longer just about personal achievement. This was about being part of something bigger than himself. "I won't lie to you," Dr. Matthews said, his tone shifting slightly. "This will be one of the most challenging experiences of your academic career. You'll have to give it everything you've got. But I think you're ready for it." Elijah took a deep breath. He had wanted this for so long, and now, it was within his reach. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady but filled with excitement. "I'm ready to take this on." Dr. Matthews smiled. "I knew you would be. We'll send over the details soon, but I just wanted you to know that you've earned this." As Elijah left Dr. Matthews' office, a sense of clarity settled over him. He wasn't just embarking on a new academic challenge. He was stepping into a future that he had once only dreamed of. And despite all the doubts and fears he had carried with him, he was ready. That evening, after the meeting, Elijah found himself sitting on the steps outside the dorm again, the same place where he had reflected just weeks ago about how far he had come. It had been a difficult journey, filled with moments of uncertainty and fear. But sitting there now, with the news of the research program, Elijah knew he had taken the right steps. Tasha joined him soon after, as always, ready to offer her unwavering support. "Hey, how'd the meeting go?" she asked, sitting beside him. Elijah smiled, the weight of everything he had been carrying feeling a little lighter. "It went great. I'm officially in. I'm part of the program." Tasha's face lit up. "Elijah, that's amazing. I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you." Elijah let out a breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. "Thanks, Tasha. I don't think I could have gotten this far without you." Tasha nudged him with her shoulder. "You did the work. You've always had it in you. Now go show the world what you're capable of." Elijah looked out at the horizon, the sun beginning to set in the distance. There was still so much to learn, so much to prove. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it all. The days following his acceptance into the advanced research program were a blur of excitement, preparation, and the quiet weight of responsibility that came with the opportunity. Elijah's mind raced with anticipation for what lay ahead, but there was still a lingering sense of doubt, a fear that despite everything he had achieved, he might not be able to keep up with the intensity of the program. He had come a long way, but now, standing at the threshold of what felt like an entirely new chapter, the enormity of the challenge hit him. It wasn't just about academic excellence anymore. It was about pushing boundaries, questioning assumptions, and making a real impact. The program wasn't something he could coast through, it would require every ounce of his effort, intelligence, and resilience. The first meeting of the research group was scheduled for the following Monday, and Elijah spent the weekend preparing. He pored over his notes, reviewed previous research, and familiarized himself with the other members of the program. The more he learned, the more he realized just how much he didn't know. The students in this program were some of the best in the country, already recognized for their contributions to the field. As Elijah sat at his desk, a stack of books and papers spread out in front of him, he couldn't help but feel small in comparison. What if I don't belong here? What if they're just waiting for me to mess up? His phone buzzed with a message from Tasha. Can't believe you're starting the program on Monday. I'm so proud of you, Elijah. You've worked hard for this. Just remember, you belong there just as much as anyone else. The message was simple, but it gave Elijah a sense of comfort. Tasha always knew just what to say. She had been his biggest cheerleader through every high and low, and her belief in him had been unwavering. He took a deep breath and put his phone down. I belong here, he thought again. I've earned this. The first meeting of the research program was held in one of the largest conference rooms on campus, and as Elijah walked in, his eyes scanned the room. There were about a dozen students gathered around a large table, each with their own laptop or stack of papers. Elijah noticed immediately that the group was diverse, a mix of backgrounds, experiences, and specialties. It was intimidating, but also exhilarating. These were the kind of people he had always hoped to collaborate with, those who pushed the boundaries of knowledge, who challenged ideas, and who strived for something bigger than themselves. Dr. Matthews stood at the front of the room, his authoritative presence commanding the attention of everyone present. He smiled as he noticed Elijah entering. "Ah, Elijah, welcome," Dr. Matthews said, gesturing for him to sit. "Everyone, this is Elijah Mitchell. I believe many of you have already heard about his recent work. I'm sure he'll be a valuable addition to the program." A few of the students nodded or offered a friendly smile, but there was one student in particular who caught Elijah's attention. She was sitting across from him, her posture confident and her eyes sharp. She had short, dark hair and was scribbling notes furiously as Dr. Matthews spoke. Elijah couldn't help but notice the intensity in her focus. She looked like someone who was already far ahead in the game. Dr. Matthews cleared his throat, pulling Elijah out of his thoughts. "We're going to start with introductions. I want each of you to briefly introduce yourselves, your background, and what you hope to achieve in this program. Let's start with you," he said, pointing to the student Elijah had been observing. The woman stood up, her voice clear and confident as she spoke. "Hi, I'm Maya Nguyen. I'm a second-year PhD student in cognitive psychology, and my research focuses on the neural mechanisms of decision-making. I've worked on several projects exploring cognitive biases, and I'm particularly interested in how they influence public policy decisions." Elijah's eyes widened. Maya's background was impressive, to say the least. She was exactly the kind of person he had feared would overshadow him in the program. But there was no time to dwell on that. As Maya finished speaking, the next person stood up, and the introductions continued around the room. When it was finally Elijah's turn, he took a deep breath and stood up. His hands were clammy, but his voice was steady as he spoke. "Hi, I'm Elijah Mitchell. I'm a sophomore in cognitive science, and my research focuses on the impact of cognitive biases on everyday decision-making. I'm particularly interested in how these biases affect individual choices and how we can use this knowledge to improve decision-making processes in various industries." There was a brief pause as the room processed his introduction. Elijah quickly sat back down, feeling a slight flush creep up his neck. It wasn't the most polished introduction, but it was honest. "I've got this," he reminded himself. Dr. Matthews nodded. "Excellent. Now, let's dive into what this program is about. Over the course of the next year, We'll be working together on a series of projects that will push the boundaries of our understanding in the field of cognitive science. You'll be working closely with your peers, collaborating on research, and presenting your findings at conferences. The rest of the meeting went by in a blur of excitement and information. Elijah listened intently as Dr. Matthews outlined the projects they would be working on, the goals they would strive for, and the challenges they would face. The program was going to be tough, there was no question about that. But the opportunity to collaborate with such brilliant minds was a dream come true. After the meeting, as everyone began to gather their things and head out, Maya approached Elijah. Her expression was neutral, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Hey, Elijah," she said, her tone casual but with an edge of challenge. "I'm looking forward to seeing what you bring to the table. It's a pretty competitive environment in here, so just be prepared." Elijah nodded, feeling a spark of competitiveness light up within him. "I'm ready. I'm looking forward to working with you." Maya's lips curled into a slight smile. "We'll see about that." Later that night, as Elijah sat on his bed in his dorm room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to enter a new phase of his journey, one that was filled with both incredible opportunity and significant pressure. The program would push him to his limits, but he wasn't backing down. Tasha called him as he was finishing up some last-minute reading. "You did great today, Elijah," she said, her voice full of pride. "You belong there. I can't wait to hear all about it." "I don't know, Tasha," Elijah admitted. "There's so much to prove. I feel like I'm not ready." "You are ready," Tasha replied confidently. "You've been ready. Just trust yourself." Elijah smiled, feeling a surge of warmth in his chest. "Thanks, Tasha. I needed to hear that." As the days passed, Elijah threw himself into the program with everything he had. He spent long hours in the lab, working on projects, brainstorming ideas, and collaborating with his peers. He was determined to show everyone, including himself, that he had what it took to be here. But as the challenges grew more complex and the stakes higher, Elijah began to realize something important. This was not just about proving himself to others, it was about proving to himself that he could rise to the occasion. That he could handle the pressure. That he was capable of achieving greatness. And no matter how hard it got, Elijah knew he would not back down. As the weeks passed, Elijah quickly learned that the advanced research program was as demanding as it was rewarding. His days became a blur of lectures, group meetings, and hours of research in the lab. The pressure to keep up with the other students, all of whom were highly accomplished in their own right, was overwhelming at times. Maya's challenge from their first meeting still lingered in the back of his mind. She was brilliant, no doubt, and every interaction with her seemed to heighten the intensity of the competition. She was always one step ahead, always diving into complex theories and ideas with ease. It seemed effortless for her. But Elijah wasn't about to let her intimidate him. Instead, he used it as motivation to push himself further. There were days when it felt like he was running on fumes. The research was grueling, and the expectations were sky-high. There were moments of doubt when he wondered if he was really cut out for this. But then, in the quiet moments, he reminded himself of the reasons he had pushed to get here in the first place, to prove his worth to himself, to others, and to those who believed in him. And one person, in particular, always stood by him through it all, Tasha. Even when Elijah found himself buried under a mountain of research and deadlines, she was there, offering her support and reminding him why he started this journey. On a particularly difficult day, after hours of failed attempts at solving a research puzzle, Elijah texted Tasha, "I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't know if I can do this. Everyone seems so much more prepared than I am." Her response came almost immediately, "Elijah, you've come this far. You've got the talent and the drive. You're in this program for a reason. Don't let the pressure make you forget that." Elijah took a deep breath after reading the message. He knew Tasha was right. But still, the doubts crept in. The following Friday, Dr. Matthews called an impromptu meeting for all the students. Elijah had been expecting it to be a casual check-in, but when he walked into the room, he could tell something was different. Dr. Matthews was standing at the front of the room, a serious expression on his face. "Everyone, we've hit a critical point in our research," Dr. Matthews began. "We've reached the stage where we need to start refining our findings and preparing for presentations. I know this is a lot, and the pressure is building. But this is the moment where we separate the good from the great. If you're not pushing yourself to the limit, you're falling behind." The room grew silent. The intensity of Dr. Matthews' words sent a jolt of nervous energy through Elijah. The pressure he had been feeling for weeks now seemed to have reached a new level. Dr. Matthews continued, "I expect each of you to present your findings to the group in 2 weeks. Your research should be original, well-argued, and backed by data. This is your chance to prove that you belong in this program." Elijah felt his heart race. The looming presentation felt like an insurmountable obstacle. He wasn't sure he was ready, and the thought of presenting in front of his peers, especially Maya, made him feel even more inadequate. Maya, of course, was the first to speak up. "We're all ready for this. I think it's time we start focusing on how we can take our research to the next level, right?" Her confidence was undeniable, and Elijah couldn't help but feel a knot form in his stomach. But he couldn't let her see his fear. Instead, he nodded. "Yeah, definitely. We've all been working hard." Dr. Matthews smiled, though his eyes were still sharp. "Good. Now, get to work. I'll see you all in 2 weeks." The next few days were a whirlwind of research, analysis, and preparation. Elijah threw himself into his project with everything he had, determined to make the best presentation possible. But despite his efforts, there were moments when he felt like he was barely keeping his head above water. The ideas weren't coming together the way he had hoped, and his confidence wavered with every obstacle he faced. There was a moment of crisis late one night when he found himself staring at his computer screen, feeling completely stuck. The research was there, but the connections he was trying to make didn't feel right. Everything he had worked on seemed to be unraveling in front of him. He sat there for a long time, hands hovering over the keyboard, his mind a jumble of thoughts. What if this isn't good enough? What if I've been chasing the wrong angle? What if I'm not meant to be here? Just as he was about to close his laptop and give in to the overwhelming sense of failure, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tasha. "Don't quit. I know it's hard, but this is the moment that defines you. Take a deep breath, look at what you've already accomplished, and remember why you're doing this." The simple words from Tasha gave him the strength he needed. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then opened his laptop again. He didn't have all the answers, but he had come too far to give up now. He spent the next few hours refining his research, pulling together his ideas, and reworking the connections. Slowly, but surely, the puzzle pieces began to fit into place. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to move forward. 2 weeks later, Elijah stood in front of his peers, his heart racing. The research presentations were finally here. His hands trembled slightly as he clicked through his slides, trying to calm his nerves. He glanced over at Maya, who was sitting in the front row, her eyes focused intently on him. He could feel the weight of her gaze, but he refused to let it shake him. Dr. Matthews stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the presentations closely. Elijah took a deep breath, then began speaking. "My research focuses on how cognitive biases influence decision-making processes, particularly in high-pressure environments. More specifically, I've explored the role of availability bias in the decisions made by individuals during moments of stress." As he spoke, his confidence grew with every passing minute. The research he had worked so hard on finally started to make sense, and the more he talked about it, the more he realized just how much he had learned throughout this journey. When he finished, there was a brief silence. He looked around the room, searching for signs of approval. Then, Maya spoke up. "That was impressive," she said, her voice calm but sincere. "You've put a lot of thought into this. I think you've hit on something important here." Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Her words, coming from someone as accomplished as Maya, meant more than he could express. He had done it. As Dr. Matthews began to give his feedback, Elijah realized that this moment, the moment he had feared, the moment he had doubted himself, wasn't the end. It was just another step on the journey. And this time, he was ready for it. The week after the presentations felt like a turning point for Elijah. His research had received positive feedback, and even Dr. Matthews seemed genuinely impressed with his progress. But Elijah knew that this was just the beginning. The real challenge was yet to come. He had always been driven by the need to prove himself, not just to others but to himself. And now, with the research program advancing and more opportunities ahead, he found himself more determined than ever to push the limits of what he was capable of achieving. Yet, the pressure was becoming increasingly intense. Late one night, after a long day of research, Elijah stood in the hallway of the building, looking out at the campus. The quiet of the night contrasted sharply with the noise in his mind. He felt the weight of his future pressing on him, the future that he had worked so hard to reach, but which now seemed more uncertain than ever. "Is this all just a fluke?" he thought. "Can I keep this up?" His thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "Elijah, you good?" Maya asked, walking up to him with a concerned look on her face. Elijah looked up, startled. "Oh, hey, Maya. Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Thinking about what?" Elijah hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to opening up about his doubts, but there was something about Maya's presence that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, it was okay to admit he wasn't invincible. "I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot riding on this. Everyone in the program is so much further along than me, and I don't want to let anyone down." Maya stood beside him, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, I've been watching you. And I think you're ahead of a lot of people in ways they don't even realize. You have a unique perspective. Don't doubt that." Elijah blinked in surprise. Maya, the one person he had been so intimidated by, was saying something like that? He didn't know how to respond at first, but Maya continued before he could say anything. "We all have our moments of doubt," she said. "But don't let it stop you. You've earned your place here, Elijah. Trust in that." Her words hit him harder than he expected. There was something incredibly powerful about the way she spoke, like she truly believed in his potential. "Thanks, Maya," he said, the sincerity in his voice surprising even him. "I needed to hear that." Maya smiled. "Anytime. Just remember, the hardest battles are often the ones that lead to the best rewards." Elijah watched her walk away, feeling a little lighter than he had before. Maybe Maya wasn't the rival he had imagined, but someone who understood the challenges of this journey. He wasn't alone in feeling overwhelmed. Everyone in the program had their own struggles, even if they didn't show it on the surface. The next week, things began to heat up. With the looming deadline for the next phase of the program fast approaching, Elijah and the other students were expected to present their final papers on their respective research topics. For Elijah, this wasn't just a presentation, it was a chance to make a real impact. He spent every waking hour refining his paper, making sure every detail was as sharp as it could be. He pored over research articles, consulted with professors, and even reached out to some of his peers for feedback. Maya, though she was often busy with her own work, offered some insight on a few of his points, and their conversations pushed Elijah to think in ways he hadn't before. Despite the collaborative spirit, the competition in the program was palpable. There were unspoken rivalries, little challenges that played out during group discussions, and moments of tension when certain students' ideas conflicted. Elijah tried to stay focused on his own work, but there were times when the pressure felt suffocating. Then, the day of the final presentation arrived. Elijah entered the auditorium, his nerves buzzing with intensity. He saw his classmates, each deep in their own preparations, but Maya stood out in the crowd. She was calmly rehearsing her notes, her poise a stark contrast to Elijah's anxious energy. He envied her confidence, but he couldn't let it distract him. The moment he was called to present, Elijah's mind went blank. For a split second, he was paralyzed by fear, but then he remembered what Maya had said, he belonged here. He had earned his place, and he had the knowledge to back it up. He took a deep breath and walked up to the podium. My research investigates the intersection between cognitive biases and decision-making, particularly in high-stress environments, Elijah began. In exploring these biases, I've found that availability bias plays a significant role in how individuals react in unpredictable, high-pressure situations, often leading to suboptimal decisions. As he spoke, his confidence slowly grew. He no longer focused on the audience or on Maya sitting in the front row. He focused on his work, on the evidence he had gathered, and on the story he had to tell. By the end of his presentation, Elijah felt a sense of relief he hadn't expected. His hands were still a little shaky, but the overwhelming fear had dissipated. He had done it. He had pushed through his doubts, and he had presented his research to the best of his ability. When the applause came, it wasn't just polite. There was genuine respect in the room. Dr. Matthews stood up first. That was an impressive presentation, Elijah. I can see the depth of your research, and I'm excited to see where you take it from here. Elijah felt a surge of pride. For the first time, it felt like the hard work, the late nights, and the countless moments of self-doubt were finally paying off. He wasn't just some student in a program anymore. He was a scholar in his own right, with ideas that could contribute something meaningful to the field. After the presentations were over, the students gathered to discuss their work. Elijah sat down beside Maya, who gave him a small smile. "You nailed it," she said, her voice genuine. "I was impressed." Elijah smiled, feeling a sense of camaraderie with her he hadn't expected. "Thanks. I was a bit nervous, but it felt good to finally present." "Yeah, the nerves don't go away," Maya said, her eyes twinkling with understanding. "But you pushed through it. That's what matters." Elijah nodded. "It's not just about the research, is it? It's about how you handle the pressure, too." Maya chuckled. "Exactly. The pressure is what sharpens you. And you're doing just fine under it." As the conversation continued, Elijah realized that the journey he had started, the one that had once seemed so overwhelming, was beginning to shape him into the person he had always hoped he could be. Strong, confident, and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt truly ready. The weeks following the final presentations felt like a whirlwind. Elijah had gained more recognition than he had expected, and the momentum from his successful presentation only fueled his drive to keep pushing forward. With the research program nearing its conclusion, the students were now working on their final projects, an opportunity to apply everything they had learned in a way that could change the course of their careers. Elijah could feel the weight of the impending deadline. But unlike before, this time, he embraced it. He was no longer running from the pressure, he was welcoming it, knowing that it would only sharpen his skills and expand his potential. But even with this newfound confidence, the final stretch of the program was not without its challenges. He had already begun to work on his project, poring over data, running simulations, and writing what would be his most important paper yet. This project would not only define his standing in the program but also pave the way for his future in the field. The nights were long, and the pressure to produce something groundbreaking was constant. The quiet of the research labs at night had become a familiar backdrop for his work, and Elijah found comfort in the stillness. But even the calmness couldn't entirely silence the doubts that crept in. Was he truly capable of producing something that would make an impact? One evening, while sifting through stacks of research papers and analyzing data, Elijah's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Tasha. "How's the project going? You've got this." Elijah smiled at the simplicity of her words. "It's going, okay. A little overwhelmed, but I'm pushing through." Tasha's response was quick, "I know you can do it. You've always been someone who rises to the challenge. This is no different." Her support had always been unwavering, and in that moment, it grounded him. He had come this far because of his determination and the belief others had in him. Elijah wasn't going to let that faith slip away. The following week, the students were called into a meeting with Dr. Matthews. The final projects were due soon, and everyone was expected to present their findings in front of a panel of experts. The weight of the situation was becoming all too real. As Elijah entered the room, he saw the usual group of students, each of them looking just as nervous as he felt. Maya stood near the front, talking to some of the other students, her calm demeanor making her seem untouchable, almost unreachable. Dr. Matthews stepped up to the front of the room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone. "We are at the final stage of this program," he began. "The next few weeks will determine where you go from here. Some of you will be offered positions with top organizations. Others will have the opportunity to continue with graduate studies. This is the moment where your work truly matters. You've all worked hard to get here, but now, you need to take it to the next level." Elijah listened intently, feeling the weight of his choices. This wasn't just about presenting research, it was about deciding his future. "You'll present your work in 2 weeks, Dr. Matthews continued. The panel will be tough, and they'll expect nothing less than excellence. So don't hold back. Be ready for tough questions, and be prepared to defend your research." Elijah felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. This wasn't going to be easy, but he had no choice but to keep moving forward. 2 weeks felt like the blink of an eye, and before Elijah knew it, the day of the final presentation had arrived. The auditorium was packed with faculty, visiting scholars, and professionals from the field. Each student was given a time slot to present, and Elijah's was fast approaching. The room was buzzing with energy as everyone prepared for their turn. Elijah sat in his seat, his stomach twisted in knots. He felt like he was on the edge of something big, like everything he had done so far was building up to this moment. This was the defining point. He glanced over at Maya. She was reviewing her slides, calm and collected, as usual. Elijah couldn't help but admire her poise. She had always been a constant reminder of the level of excellence he was striving for, but today, he didn't feel like the underdog anymore. He had earned his place here, and he was going to prove it. His name was called, and Elijah stood up, walking slowly toward the podium. Every step felt like an eternity, but when he reached the front, he steadied himself. He glanced out at the panel of experts sitting in front of him, their eyes fixed on him expectantly. He cleared his throat and began. "My research focuses on decision-making under stress, specifically looking at how cognitive biases can affect critical choices during high-pressure situations. In particular, I've explored how availability bias, which causes people to rely on easily available information, can lead to flawed decisions when the stakes are high." As Elijah spoke, he felt his nerves begin to settle. The words flowed naturally, and for the first time, he realized that this wasn't just a presentation. It was the culmination of everything he had worked for, the late nights, the struggles, the doubts, all of it had led to this moment. He finished his presentation, and there was a brief silence. The panel of experts exchanged looks before Dr. Matthews spoke. "Impressive, Elijah. Your analysis is thorough, and your conclusions are sound. But I have to ask, you mentioned cognitive biases, but how do you see this research impacting real-world decision-making? How could this knowledge change the way people operate in high-pressure environments?" Elijah felt his heart race again. This was the type of question he had been preparing for, and now, he had to answer with clarity and confidence. He took a deep breath, remembering the countless hours he had spent developing his theory. The application of this research could revolutionize decision-making training in high-stress fields like medicine, law enforcement, and business. By understanding cognitive biases, professionals could be trained to recognize when their judgment might be clouded and take steps to make more informed, deliberate decisions. The panel nodded in approval, and Elijah's confidence grew as he continued to speak. When the questioning ended, he received a round of applause. It wasn't just polite, it felt earned. After the presentation, Elijah walked out of the auditorium, his head buzzing with adrenaline. The hardest part was over, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel a sense of accomplishment. As he left the building, he spotted Tasha waiting for him outside. She smiled when she saw him. "Well? How did it go?" she asked eagerly. Elijah grinned. "I think I did all right." Tasha hugged him tightly. "I knew you would. You've worked so hard for this, Elijah. You've earned every bit of it." "I wouldn't have made it without your support," Elijah said, his voice full of gratitude. "You've been with me every step of the way." Tasha smiled softly. "That's what friends are for." As they walked together, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come a long way since the first day he had set foot in the program. He had faced doubts, challenges, and competition. But through it all, he had kept moving forward. And now, with the final presentation behind him, he could see the horizon stretching out before him, full of opportunities, challenges, and the promise of a future he was finally ready to embrace. The days after Elijah's final presentation felt like a blur. The adrenaline from the big day still coursed through his veins, keeping him awake at night, replaying every moment of the presentation in his mind. But as the immediate excitement began to fade, a new feeling emerged: uncertainty. The uncertainty about what came next. Elijah had done everything he could to succeed in the program, but now that the pressure had eased, a question lingered in his mind: what now? The program was winding down, and in a few short weeks, the students would go their separate ways. Some would be taking internships, others preparing for graduate school, and a few might even be offered jobs by prestigious companies that had been attending the presentations. Elijah wasn't sure where he stood yet. He hadn't received any official offers, and that was enough to put him on edge. Had his research been good enough? Was he as capable as he had hoped? That night, as Elijah sat alone in his dorm room, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Maya. "Hey, Elijah. Got a second?" He texted back quickly, "Of course. What's up?" Maya's reply came a few moments later. "I wanted to check in on you. You seemed a little off after your presentation. Everything okay?" Elijah smiled, surprised by her thoughtfulness. "Yeah, just feeling a little overwhelmed, you know. It's like the pressure's gone, but now I'm questioning what happens next." There was a brief pause before Maya responded. "I get it. It's like the hardest part is over, but the real challenge is still ahead, figuring out what's next. But listen, you've made it this far because you have what it takes. Whatever comes next, you're going to handle it. You always do." Elijah appreciated her words, even if he wasn't completely convinced. Still, he couldn't deny the sense of reassurance they brought. "Thanks, Maya. You're right. It's just a lot to process. I get it. If you need anything, just let me know. We're all in this together, after all." Elijah couldn't help but feel grateful for her friendship. Maya, who had once been his competition, was now a reminder that the people around him were not just rivals, but allies, too. It was a rare bond, one that would serve him well in the future. The next few days were filled with interviews and follow-up meetings. Elijah found himself juggling several opportunities, each promising a different path forward. One company offered him a research assistant position, another a chance to work on a major project in data analysis. A few professors encouraged him to consider graduate school, citing his natural aptitude for research. Each offer was an opportunity, but it was also a choice, and Elijah wasn't sure how to navigate them all. He had always been focused on the task at hand, one step at a time. But now, the future stretched out before him like an unfamiliar road, full of decisions he had never expected to face. One afternoon, while sitting with Tasha in the campus cafe, he finally voiced his frustration. "I'm not sure what to do," Elijah confessed, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "All these opportunities are on the table, but I don't know which one is the right one. It feels like the next step could either define my entire future or ruin it." Tasha gave him a reassuring smile, though her eyes were full of understanding. "Elijah, you've already made it this far. Look at everything you've accomplished. You've earned all of these opportunities. The choice might be hard, but it's a good problem to have." Elijah leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of her words. "But what if I make the wrong choice? What if I pick the wrong direction and it all falls apart?" Tasha set her coffee down and met his gaze with unwavering confidence. "Then you pick yourself up and try again. It's that simple. You're not alone in this, remember. You've got a whole support system behind you, friends, mentors, people who believe in you. And don't forget, you've already proven that you can handle challenges. You've already exceeded expectations. Whatever happens, you'll find a way through it." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always felt like he was alone in this journey, like the weight of his success or failure rested solely on his shoulders. But Tasha was right. He had a support system, and that made all the difference. A few days later, Elijah received a call that would change everything. "Hello, Elijah. This is Dr. Matthews," the familiar voice said over the phone. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I wanted to talk to you about the next steps regarding your future here at the university." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "Of course, Dr. Matthews. What's going on?" "I've been in touch with a few colleagues, and after reviewing your work in the program, I'm pleased to say that we're offering you a position as a research assistant with the department. We think you have immense potential, and we'd like to continue working with you. This position would give you the opportunity to work on some groundbreaking projects and further develop your skills. I think it's the next logical step for you." Elijah was stunned. He had hoped for an opportunity like this, but hearing it from Dr. Matthews was more than he could have imagined. I don't know what to say. Thank you. This is incredible. I knew you'd be the right fit for this position, Elijah, Dr. Matthews said. But I want you to take your time and think about it. We're offering you a lot of responsibility, and it's going to be demanding. But we think you're ready for it. You've already proven that to all of us. Elijah's mind was racing, but for the first time in a long while, he felt certain about his path. This was the opportunity he had worked so hard for. It wasn't just the next step, it was the beginning of a career he had always dreamed of. That evening, as Elijah sat down to talk to Tasha about the offer, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't felt in weeks. "You did it," Tasha said with a grin. "This is what you've been working for." "I know," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "And I'm ready for it. I'm ready for the next chapter." Elijah had come so far, not just in his academic career, but in his personal journey. The doubts, the fears, the setbacks, they were all part of his growth. And now, standing at the threshold of his future, Elijah realized that no matter where he went next, he was prepared to face whatever came his way. With a sense of purpose and a quiet confidence, Elijah stepped into the unknown, knowing that the best was yet to come. The weeks following the offer from Dr. Matthews were filled with a whirlwind of new experiences. Elijah had accepted the research assistant position with the university's department, excited and nervous all at once. This was his chance to prove to himself, and to everyone else, that he was ready for the challenges ahead. But as he quickly learned, the real test had only just begun. On his first day, Elijah was introduced to the team he would be working with, a diverse group of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers, each with their own area of expertise. The leader of the team, Dr. Elizabeth Farrow, was a renowned figure in cognitive psychology, and she had a reputation for pushing her researchers to their limits. Elijah knew that he had a lot to prove, especially considering the group's collective experience. They were all highly accomplished, and he felt like the youngest person in the room. "Welcome to the team, Elijah," Dr. Farrow greeted him with a firm handshake. "We're glad to have you on board. You'll be working with Dr. Stevenson and Maria on the neural networks portion of the project. We've been stuck on a few key aspects of the analysis, and we're hoping your skills can help us move past the hurdles." Elijah nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. He had only recently learned the intricacies of neural network models during his time in the program, but now he would have to apply that knowledge in a real-world setting with high stakes. The first task Elijah was assigned was to help with data cleaning and preprocessing. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential to the research. Elijah spent hours each day running through massive datasets, trying to identify errors, inconsistencies, and gaps. The task was tedious, but it gave him a chance to prove himself by paying attention to the smallest details. By the end of the first week, Elijah's confidence had begun to grow. He realized that although the work was challenging, it wasn't any more difficult than the problems he had faced during his time in the research program. What mattered was his ability to stay focused and keep pushing forward. On the second week, however, things started to get more complicated. Dr. Farrow asked Elijah to take the lead on a small section of the neural network analysis. He was tasked with running simulations to predict the impact of certain cognitive biases on decision-making patterns. At first, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Elijah set up the simulations, adjusted the parameters, and ran a few test runs. But when the results came back, something didn't add up. The predictions were inaccurate, and the data was showing inconsistencies that didn't make sense. Elijah spent the next several hours troubleshooting. He checked every line of code, re-examined the data, and even consulted with Maria, who was more experienced in neural networks. After a lot of back and forth, they discovered that there had been an error in the pre-processing stage. One small mistake had thrown off the entire model. Elijah was frustrated. He knew that mistakes were part of the process, but this felt like a major setback. He had let the team down. As the pressure mounted, he couldn't help but question himself. What if I'm not cut out for this? What if they made a mistake by hiring me? Maria noticed his frustration. "Hey, don't beat yourself up," she said, offering a kind smile. "Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is that you figured it out and got the model back on track. We're learning as we go, and you're doing great." Her words offered some comfort, but the pressure was still weighing on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had to prove himself, especially in front of Dr. Farrow. By the end of the week, Elijah had fixed the error and successfully reran the simulations. The results were much more accurate, and the team was able to move forward with their analysis. But Elijah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the next challenge would be even harder. A few days later, Elijah sat in Dr. Farrow's office for a one-on-one meeting. He had been working diligently on his assigned tasks, but he had grown anxious about whether he was truly meeting her expectations. "Sit down, Elijah," Dr. Farrow said as he entered the room. Her demeanor was calm, but there was an edge to her voice that made Elijah's heart race. "I've been reviewing your progress, and I want to talk about your performance." Elijah's stomach tightened. Was this the moment where she would tell him he wasn't cut out for the role? But then Dr. Farrow leaned forward and smiled. "You've been doing a great job. The neural network simulations are back on track, and your attention to detail has been impressive. I've seen a lot of improvement in your work ethic. But I need you to push yourself even further." Elijah blinked, caught off guard. "Pushing myself further?" he asked, trying to mask his surprise. "Yes. You've been reactive so far, handling the problems as they come, which is great. But the next step is to become proactive. I want to see you take more initiative. Start proposing new experiments, developing new ideas. We're working on cutting-edge research, and I need you to start thinking like a leader. Elijah felt the weight of her words settle over him. Be proactive. Think like a leader. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that. He had always been the one reacting, responding to problems as they came. But now, Dr. Farrow was pushing him to step up, to take ownership of his work and the direction it would go. Can you do that? She asked, her voice steady. Elijah took a deep breath, the weight of the challenge settling in. Yes. I'll start thinking bigger. I'll start proposing new ideas. Dr. Farrow smiled again, her approval making Elijah feel a little lighter. I believe in you, Elijah. You've got what it takes. After that meeting, Elijah felt both invigorated and overwhelmed. He knew that to meet Dr. Farrow's expectations, he would have to grow in ways he hadn't imagined before. It wasn't just about completing tasks, it was about creating new pathways and leading the way forward. He had to trust himself in ways he never had before. That night, as Elijah sat at his desk, staring at the research papers and data in front of him, something clicked. He had always been so focused on following directions, on meeting expectations. But now, he had the freedom to shape the direction of his work, to take ownership of his future. And just like that, Elijah realized that the real test was not in his ability to solve problems, it was in his ability to create new ones and solve them before anyone else even realized they were problems. Elijah had come a long way since that fateful day when Dr. Matthews had offered him the research assistant position. What had once seemed like an insurmountable challenge had become his new reality, and every day felt like a new opportunity to prove himself. But as Elijah worked tirelessly on his projects, pushing himself to new heights, he began to realize that the true measure of success wasn't just about completing tasks or meeting expectations. It was about leaving a legacy, creating work that would last far beyond his time at the university. As the semester drew to a close, Elijah found himself reflecting on how much he had changed. It wasn't just the new skills he had developed or the knowledge he had gained, it was the way he viewed the world and his place within it. In the past, Elijah had been driven by the need to prove others wrong, to show that he was capable despite the doubts that had been cast upon him. But now, his motivation had shifted. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to himself that he could make a difference, that he could leave a mark on the world. One evening, after a particularly long day of analyzing data and working with the research team, Elijah sat alone in the lab. His mind wandered back to the day he had first stepped into the program, unsure of what he could offer, questioning whether he was truly capable. He thought about the doubts he had carried with him, about the things people had said, the challenges he had faced, and how, against all odds, he had risen above them. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Tasha. "Hey, how's everything going?" Elijah smiled as he read the message. Tasha had been with him through thick and thin, and her unwavering support had helped him reach this point. He quickly typed back. "It's going well. A bit tired, but good. I've been reflecting on everything, how much has changed since we first started this journey." There was a pause before she replied. "I get that. It's been crazy to see you grow. But you've earned every step of it, Elijah. You've always had it in you." Elijah couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, Tasha. I don't know where I'd be without your support." "You'd be fine," Tasha texted back with a wink emoji. "But I'm glad I could be there. You're going to do amazing things, I know it." As Elijah sat there, reading her message, he realized that Tasha was right. He had come so far, and the best part was that he wasn't done yet. There was so much more he wanted to accomplish, so much more he wanted to learn. But now, he felt ready. He was no longer just a student. He was becoming a leader in his own right, carving out a path for himself in a world that had once seemed out of reach. The final weeks of the semester were a blur of final presentations, research papers, and reflections on the journey that had led him here. Elijah spent long hours perfecting his work, making sure everything was just right. And as the final day of presentations arrived, he stood before his peers, colleagues, and professors with a newfound sense of purpose. Dr. Farrow stood at the front of the room, addressing the group with her usual confidence. Today, we'll hear from some of our brightest minds. These students have made remarkable strides in their research, and I couldn't be prouder of each of you. Elijah, I'd like you to start us off today. Elijah's heart skipped a beat as he stood up, making his way to the front of the room. He had spoken in front of audiences before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a presentation. This was a culmination of everything he had worked for, everything he had learned. He took a deep breath and began. Good morning, everyone. My name is Elijah Jenkins, and today I'll be presenting my work on neural networks and decision-making processes. I've spent the last several months analyzing the impact of cognitive biases on decision outcomes, and I believe my findings could have a significant impact on the field. As he spoke, Elijah felt the familiar rush of excitement and purpose. He had always been good at explaining his work, but today, something was different. Today, he wasn't just sharing facts and figures. He was sharing his journey, his story. The room was quiet as Elijah spoke, his voice steady and confident. As he explained his findings, he could see Dr. Farrow nodding in approval. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, and for the first time, he wasn't just a student. He was a researcher, a peer. When he finished his presentation, the room erupted into applause. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. As he stepped down from the podium, Dr. Farrow was already walking toward him, her expression one of pride. You've done excellent work, Elijah, she said, her voice filled with admiration. I'm proud of you. You've come a long way since you first started here. I think you've truly found your place. Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Thank you, Dr. Farrow. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. After the presentation, the entire department gathered for a final reception. Elijah found himself standing in a corner, reflecting on the moment. He had made it. He had gone from being underestimated and overlooked to becoming someone who was respected in his field. It wasn't just about the research or the accolades. It was about the growth, the transformation. As the night wore on, Elijah felt a sense of peace. He had found his calling. And this was only the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?